thank you everyone for joining in for our special time slot SAgE seminar series today. I'm delighted to introduce you all to Professor Quinn Thomas, who's visiting us here from Virginia Tech in the USA. And so Quinn's a data science and faculty fellow at Virginia Tech and is part of the departments of forest resource and environmental conservation and biological sciences. So he's a computationally oriented ecosystem scientist with research that focuses on combining models and observations to really help advance our predictive capacity in ecology. And so to grow the field of ecological forecasting and community, he's leading an NSF-funded ecological forecasting initiative research coordination network. And Quinn also holds a PhD from Cornell University in ecosystem ecology. And prior to joining the faculty, prior to joining the faculty at Virginia Tech, he was a postdoc at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. So lots of wonderful research, your wonderful research journey there. So I'm sure, like everyone else who's tuned in today, we're excited to hear about your research, Quinn. So I'll hand over to you.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin, for organizing this and the kind introduction. It's really great to be here. It's virtual, but I'm in the same city as everybody, and have been really enjoying my time in Perth and at UWA. It's quite an institution, and it's a very livable, fun city. And I'm excited to kind of share some kind of stories about ecological forecasting to kind of introduce you to the field and highlight some elements of it. And for those of you that attended Caitlin Carey's talk a few weeks ago, you'll see many connections. And hopefully it reinforces ideas. And if you weren't, it's not assuming that you saw that seminar either. And so to get started, the big background thing is that decisions are being made in the context of a rapidly changing environment. Things like algal blooms, endangered species, bird migrations, fisheries, forest yields, even things like when to travel to see the best fall colors in the US, because that's a huge tourist thing. These decisions are being made, so it's a question of whether they're, ecology can help inform those decisions or not. And so our goal is to move from the left, which is this like hazy outlook on the future, to using forecasting to kind of mark out the different decisions that can be made to lead to the environment that we desire. And so the big theme is predicting nature like we predict weather, taking data to models to produce actionable information that can be used by society. And so the ecological sciences are really undergoing a transformation similar to what meteorology and weather forecasting has done in the past. And just a very high level overview of a weather forecasting enterprise is that you have a weather forecasting model that's a mechanistic model of how the atmosphere works. And all across the globe, terabytes and terabytes of data are being collected and being made available publicly through standardized APIs that then all the different modeling groups across the world access to then nudge the model closer to reality. These data are an imperfect view of the world, but an incomplete and imperfect, but together they help paint a picture that nudges the model so that it's more consistent with the way things are now, which then helps constrain this updated weather forecast into the future. And then that's translated into decision support, like a standard kind of weather forecast you might see. And apologies for not getting a Perth forecast, but you can see here that this is sometime in the summer in the US. And so, what's emerging in ecology is this sort of revolution of the observation system. Weather forecasts are the improvement, the gains in weather forecasts over the past decades is a multi-part enterprise of better models, but also better observing systems. And so ecology is really undergoing that, particularly through the networks. Like the US has a National Ecological Observatory network. There's other long-term observations. There's lake ones. Australia has a network called TERN. There's flux networks, combine that with satellites, and there is a ton of data that's flowing out there that is ready to be harnessed. And so, we kind of take this overarching ecological forecasting concept to kind of harness this data revolution. And I'll kind of walk you through this kind of generic overview of what we consider kind of the unified ecological forecasting framework, where you start here with an ecological model. It can be anything from a machine learning model to a regression to a process-based model. And you implement this in a cyber infrastructure that allows for the generation of automated forecasts. Those automated forecasts, are being generated. At the same time, data is being acquired and ingested and processed so that it can be met with the forecasts to update and evaluate the model, in many cases through a process called data assimilation. Those forecasts are then archived for future analysis, because the only way that we will be able to make that figure that says we are gaining a month of predictability per decade, which is what the weather community can really show, that we are actually getting better at weather forecasting. The only way to do that is to archive our forecasts now. And so this repository is really critical for future analysis of our successes and failures. It's translated to decision support to be actionable. These dotted lines emphasize, the solid lines are kind of manual things, and then the solid lines are automated. This is really emphasizing co-production, meaning the decision makers are involved from the beginning of the development of the models and in the translation of the automated forecasts to decision support. And then finally, over time, as we collect more and more and more forecasts, we can advance our theory and improve models. By forecasting with a lot of different models, maybe with different underlying mechanisms, hypotheses about how the world works, we're able to then see which ones perform on out-of-sample evaluation, because inherently we are comparing the model to data that was not available at the time that the forecast was generated. We can over time discover which models are better and hopefully advance our theory. And so, and then actually over time you can learn to say, hey, we really need data here because this is a really uncertain and unconstrained element. So it can feed back to refine data collection as well. And so my talk really has a set of 5 data science themes. The idea of spatially and temporally heterogeneous data that simultaneously results in both a data deluge and a data drought. In some cases, we have a ton of data on one thing and very little data on this other thing, and you need both for a model. Really leveraging our existing environmental knowledge and mechanistic models in the context of emerging kind of statistical machine learning tools, not throwing not throwing out all the prior knowledge just because we've come up with some fancy machine learning tool. How do you leverage both our historical knowledge? Multiple drivers of forecast uncertainty that really requires quantification. The idea of automated, reliable, secure, and reproducibility of workflows across diverse compute infrastructures, and co-development of stakeholders to maximize decision support. And so I'm going to talk about 3 examples of ecological forecasting: water quality, forest production, and environmental observatories. And wanted to give a very brief introduction to the things I'm not going to cover here. That's part of my research program. Broadly, I'm an environmental scientist who uses data science to tackle environmental challenges. And so some other areas of my research program ask, how does air pollution influence forest demographics, like nitrogen deposition from fossil fuel combustion and agricultural activities? What role does nutrient limitation play in Earth's carbon cycle and climate, using Earth system models and understanding biogeochemical feedbacks on climate? And finally, how can land be most effectively managed for climate change mitigation? Thinking about how measurements of biometeorology and carbon exchange can be used to understand how different land uses, particularly for bioenergy production, influence the radiative forcing of the atmosphere. So I won't be talking about these, but I'm super happy to talk about those afterwards, after the talk. So let's start with water quality. And so, the idea here is to use reservoir forecasts to improve water quality management. And I like to think about problems from both the application and the data science side. If it has an application but doesn't really kind of advance the fundamental kind of science of data analysis, forecasting, data assimilation, that kind of thing, it's less interesting to me. And so you'll see the theme here where, there's certain aspects of the data science that are advanced simultaneously by advancing an application. And so the application here is really algal blooms and low oxygen are increasing in lakes globally due to land use and climate. And so water temperature and oxygen forecasts and other water quality variables could actually guide preemptive management action, whether it be treating the reservoir, changing the chemicals in a water plant, shifting to alternative water sources. And inherently, it's the integration of physics, chemistry, and biology. On the data science side, it really is a need for automated forecasts with lead times of 1 week for management. And here we also have heterogeneous observation systems requiring flexible tools. There's not one sensor. There's many different types of sensors out there. There's many ways that they're connected to the internet. There's many different scales, whether it be a single sensor in a lake, multiple sensors in the stream flowing into the lake. So it's a really heterogeneous observation system that has to be dealt with. And it requires kind of fusing mechanistic models with data. And so this is the team. You may have seen this in Kaylin's talk a few weeks ago. It's really an interdisciplinary team that's been supported by multiple National Science Foundation grants. And really, is a genuine collaboration between kind of domain scientists, computer scientists, social scientists, and resource managers. And from this picture, you can guess which of these is the water manager who has to make decisions on water quality. The only one who looks like he's not an ecologist out in the field, over on the right. And so the big theme here is data assimilation with mechanistic hydrodynamic ecosystem model. And another name for this is data model fusion. And what we do is we take a mechanistic model. In this case, we're using the GLM model that has been developed out of Matt Hipsey's group, and we create a lot of different predictions with that model. They're called ensemble members. Data comes in, and the set of ensembles is updated to be consistent with that observation, but recognizing that observation has uncertainty, which creates a nice spread moving forward. And this particular method is called the ensemble common filter that also has state augmentation that allows for you to also simultaneously estimate parameters. And you may ask, why go through all this effort? Why not just take the observations from the temperature sensor in the lake and just shove them in the model as the starting point? And really, the reason why we go through all this computational effort is because these models require an initial starting point, but only a few of the states typically have observations. So you have to make assumptions about all the other observations. And this approach basically helps figure out what those others should be that allows them to be consistent with the observations that we do have. And it also can help reduce that initial condition uncertainty and also reduce and parameter uncertainty and help calibrate them over time to the current conditions. And so our automated workflow looks like this. So we have our model driver. We have a MET station in the reservoir. We have our observational data that's, we call our in situ data that's dangling down and measuring processes in the lake. Those are all pushed to GitHub so that we know that the transfer was complete. And then that is used to run the lake model, which the model output is updated using data from within the lake that sets the initial conditions for a weather forecast. It uses National Oceanographic and Atmosphere Administration Global Ensemble Forecasting System, which then produces model output that's pushed to GitHub or some other source like an S3 bucket, and then is processed into the information in the format that the Water Authority asked for, and then they get an email every morning. And so this is kind of the general automated workflow. And what's been really exciting about this project is the fundamental advances in computer science that have been associated with it. And so behind this sort of broad theme is a set of cloud-based automated workflows where we have the observation system, and then each of these boxes is a kind of a unique and complete process that can be run anywhere in the world. And it all centers around what we have, which is basically a storage system a networked storage system called an S3 cloud storage. And the beauty of this is, we have all these kind of tasks where we generate, the in situ data in a process format, inflow, outflow, lake forecasts, weather forecast, evaluation, visualization. They all have interdependencies, and but they're all kind of contained. And so what that allows us to do is actually run all of these in many different locations using different triggers, like wait for this to finish before doing that, using kind of an open source approach. And so our workflows are not running in any one place. Some are running at Virginia Tech, some are running on IBM Cloud, some are running on National Science Foundation computers. It's all this sort of diverse cloud-based automation that really kind of takes advantage of kind of various computational systems out there. And so our first application of this system is Falling Creek Reservoir, located in Virginia, outside of where Virginia Tech is. And it's a drinking water reservoir, fairly shallow. It has problems with algal blooms and high metals, and is actually managed for water, drinking water. And so, so we generate these forecasts, and this just gives you an example of forecasts that have been evaluated after the forecasting period. And, here's just showing two depths, the surface and the bottom of the reservoir. And, with the mean of the forecast and the 95% confidence intervals over here. And this is the GLM-based forecast. And then over here is an example of a null forecast. For example, if we were just making observations all the time and said, hey, we don't really know what's going on, we're just going to say that, tomorrow is the same as today. We call that the persistence null. And, that's an example over here. And so you can sort of see, yes, the process-based forecast is much stronger than the persistence null. And so we can start to look at the idea of, how good a forecast is into the future. And over in this plot on the left-hand side, the dotted lines are basically how good the forecast is. We use a method called continuous rank probability score to evaluate it, because it allows you to evaluate the full distribution rather than the mean of the forecast. But it's effectively the same as a mean absolute error. And so you can see as you go further in the future, error grows. That's to be expected. It grows more at the surface for the persistence null than it does using the GLM, which is the solid line here. And then down below, down at deep, tomorrow is the same as today is not an unreasonable assumption, because it's because it's basically because of stratification of the reservoir, it's protected from the day-to-day variations of the atmosphere. And so we significantly improve over the persistence null at the surface, and it's sort of equivocal down deep whether just having a sensor is just as good as running a fancy forecasting model. But over here, this is kind of a plot that shows you that we spend all of this effort quantifying uncertainty. Do we actually do a good job? And so so in this case, we ran 475 days of forecasts and asked, does 90% of the data fall within our 90% confidence interval? And so you would go over here to 90% confidence interval and ask whether 90% of the data fell within that. And at the 1, 7, and 16-day horizons, it does, because it falls on the 1-to-1 line. And so we have really well-calibrated confidence intervals and spend a lot of time. If it sits on this corner, that means your forecast confidence is too large. If it sits over in this corner, that means our forecast confidence is too small. And so you want to fall on this 1-to-1 line. And we are able to do that nicely. And we can also examine what are the real drivers of uncertainty across depth and time. And on the left here is 1 meter deep. And it shows you that initially, most of the uncertainty, this is days in the future. And this is the proportional of total variance. And so initially, the uncertainty in the model, which we call the process, really dominates. The overall uncertainty goes up, which is the dotted line, but the relative component of it that is process really starts out large in the beginning. The greens are various aspects of meteorological uncertainty. But by the end of the 16 days, the uncertainty is really driven by the uncertainty in the weather forecasting models and the uncertainty in translating that to our local site. That's at the surface. Down deep, it's really the process model that is really driving the uncertainty. The overall variance is lower, as shown by the dotted line here, but the proportion that's contributed to the fact that the model, doesn't do a perfect job of simulating hydrodynamics is the dominant source of uncertainty. And that makes sense because of the stratification of the system kind of decoupling down deep from the immediate atmosphere and the buffering before the atmosphere really starts to influence the deeper parts of the lake. And the other neat thing is as you get into fall in the US, we have an event called turnover where the surface water and the deep water are approximately the same temperature so that a nice gust of wind can just mix the lake. And there's stuff that had collected down deep during the summer that now gets moved up and distributed throughout the water column. And since the water authority is pulling from different depths, then knowing that this is occurring in advance can help them prepare for an abrupt shift in water quality at a depth they may be pulling from because they think that the water quality should be good. And so being able to forecast this turnover event in advance is was the #1 thing that was identified by the water authority as a need. And this it shows here, the water samples over here show before turnover and the day of turnover, how the water quality changes. And we're able to anticipate water quality forecast in the 10-day ahead range. And so we've been really upfront about putting it out there so that we have a stake in the sand, so that our forecasts are genuine of the future. They weren't hindcasts or something we generated in the past to show the power of the forecasting system. We kind of make sure that that it's out there, that it's a genuine forecast of the future, and kind of show that that we're able to kind of anticipate these adverse water quality events about 10 days in the future. And you can kind of see here the probability of it occurring, about 7 days in the future starts to really get above 50%. As you see it go from 0. This is like current day, and then this is number of days in the future, and then the probability of turnover occurring. And on the right here is actually the forecasted temperature, and you can see that basically turnover occurs where the surface and the deep water temperatures meet. And so the system is really used by water resource managers, and this is non-trivial. And to really integrate ecological forecasts and decision making really requires the development of relationships. You can't just put it out there in the void and hope that it gets taken up. And so, we've, particularly Kaylin has developed a long-term relationship with the Western Virginia Water Authority. And that includes, ranging from the daily emails with the observation system and the forecasts to biannual updates to leadership and board. And, we're setting up this now in 2 other of their reservoirs that they're helping support. And it's also in demand by other water utilities. And you can see that the picture here shows you the long-term relationship. This is them giving us, our annual project meeting usually involves a tour of a different water treatment plant. And they're very excited to show us around. And what's also really exciting is that, so this flare system right now, we can produce water temperature forecasts. And we also can produce forecasts of oxygen and chlorophyll A, but just the water temperature forecasts themselves can be used by others as inputs to their models. Where we're using weather forecasts as our kind of inputs, well, others can use our water temperature forecasts as inputs to their ecological model. And so we've had 2 examples come out that by PhD students. One thinking about algal blooms by Whitney Wilmer, and the other methane ebullition by Ryan McClure. And they both use water temperature output to forecast these variables at the same reservoir. And then finally, we're working on scaling to other lakes. And so the National Ecological Observatory Network in the US, which is this 30-year, $500 million funded effort to build a monitoring system, standardized monitoring system across the US, has 6 lakes in the lower 48 states. And they all have the same data protocols, same way of accessing data, same measurements. And so we can get this system working at one lake, and then it works at all instantly. And so we've run our forecasting system at all 6 lakes that differ in depth, they differ in size, they differ in climate. It's really been a good test of the system. And you can see one, we've been able to push it out 35 days, and two, the same kind of patterns of the forecast accuracy degrading through time. We're kind of seeing things level off in about the 16-day horizon, but you can see that there's variation among these different lakes, where the different colors are different lakes. The blues are the southern lakes, and the reds and oranges are the northern lakes. You can see that it varies. And we're just at the beginning of the phase of this, but as we start to collect more and more collection of lakes that are being forecasted, we can start to analyze patterns of forecastability. And so this is kind of an early analysis of this, but we can look at across these 6 lakes, look at accuracy, which is how good the initial forecast is and how rapidly it degrades, and then say, well, how is that correlated with catchment size, maximum depth, air temperature, fetch, various other things, characteristics of these lakes. And while this is not a definitive answer, because it's only 6 lakes, it starts to set hypotheses that, for example, like we expect that as catchment size goes up, that the accuracy goes down. We expect that as volume goes up, accuracy degradation goes up. And we're sort of, kind of working through the mechanisms explaining this, but this more is illustrative of the kind of analysis that we can start to do when forecasting a lot of different things using the same kind of protocols and archiving and saving these types of forecasts. And so that was the water quality example. I'm going to move on to a forest production example. And so, the future productivity of our pine plantations in the US has both an application and data science advances. On the application side, there's planning for the influence of climate change on productivity. These are investments are being made in these systems. I've been called up by fund managers about about this kind of work, how are the forests expected to change? It represents 16% of the world's timber volume, and it's 11 million hectares, and it's a foundation of the southeastern U.S. forest product economy. These are plantations. These are trees planted in rows that are cut after about 20 to 30 years, with their fate being anything from paper to cardboard boxes to wood pellets for Europe. And so, it's a very actively kind of managed system. On the data science side, it really helps advance methods for integrating diverse data sources into forecasts. There's many things you can measure about a forest. There's large data sets across multiple environmental gradients. Given the economic value of this system, there's there's measurements that have been made for both kind of industry type observations, but also kind of more open source type observations. And it's a relatively simple ecological system. These are, in many cases, it's the exact same genetic individual that are planted in kind of rows, and with competition control, removing other trees here. And so this is, in many cases, more of a crop than a forest. But at the same time, these are trees, and they grow quite fast, and are an excellent system for kind of pushing forward some of the data science, data fusion aspects. And this project was, I was one of many members of this team. It was actually led by the University of Florida. That was a $20 million Department of Agricultural funded project to help advance the understanding of climate change impacts on pines, and help get it to decision makers and landowners and land managers. And so the big task was first synthesizing 35 years of forestry research into a single data table that can be integrated into a model. And these include some really amazing work. They pumped CO2 into forests for over 10 years and rose the atmospheric CO2 in these forests. And so we have control plots and then treatment plots. So we have an outlook on how these respond to higher CO2. Over here on the left is they put basically gutters underneath these to divert water away. And so we have experiments that where throughfall has been reduced by 30% over many years. There's an unknownly large number of trees that have their diameters been measured and their growth. And we also can put sensors on towers above these systems to measure the carbon dioxide and water exchange with the atmosphere. So all total, you see, this is the southeastern U.S. There's gradients in both precipitation and temperature across this region, with the outline being the range that these loblolly pines have grown natively. And so really pulling all this together into a single ecosystem model to then forecast change is really what the effort has been to push forward. And so to pull it all together, we've really focused on this idea of taking a process-based model in data. And so we use a very simple model. I won't get into the details of it, but it does think of the world as carbon coming in, carbon going out, trees dying, dropping their leaves, and then a very simple bucket model. And ultimately, we kind of calibrate 75 parameters, which sounds like a lot. But when you have 300 plots, each with hundreds of measurements each, your ratio of parameters to data is still heavily in the data's favor. And so we use a Bayesian state space approach here. And I'm not going to get into the details of Bayesian state space approach, but I will answer the question, why did you go through some sort of complicated thing when you just could have done this other simple thing? And so the standardized, a more standard approach is you take your model prediction, you think about how it compares to your model, and you tune parameters to minimize effectively that difference between observations and the model. And so the issue there is that we don't know whether the disagreement is due to issues with the fact that our observations have uncertainty or the fact that our models have uncertainty. What the state space approach allows you to do is to separate these two. Your models produce something called a latent state that has error, and that is the state of the system before being measured. And then measurement uncertainty is added onto that before being compared to an observation. And so this is kind of a hierarchical Bayesian approach. And so, why go through all this effort? Frankly, it's because, we really genuinely live in a world with imperfect observations, and separating that uncertainty is critical, because if you're propagating forward error in time, the model error tomorrow depends on the model error today, while the observation error does not. And so you're going to get different answers with how error propagates forward through time if you don't separate out the observation error well. And we have a lot of ideas on how we have observations of the observational error through sampling, various other expert knowledge, so we can really separate it out. And so we went through that effort to do that. And so the idea is you take a forest model, data, existing knowledge, priors. I sat down with my forestry colleagues and said, hey, where should this parameter fit? Like, what's its range? What do you think its mean is? Pulling from data from the literature. That's the power of a Bayesian approach. You have prior knowledge. You really optimize it with Bayesian statistics by fitting all plots, experiment types, data types all at once. And you have to do that. This is like kind of the sort of like a job that sits on a computer for a week and gobbles up computing time. But in the end, what you get is parameters, their distributions, quantified uncertainty that then you take and in our world, we planted a forest. We planted a forest now, and then we planted a forest at mid-century, and then let that grow according to the climate and propagated forward the model and process uncertainty. And this Monte Carlo uncertainty propagation leads to distributions like this, where it's the biomass at age 25 when a forest is typically harvested, and we have its probability density. And we did this across the region, and we focused on mid-century as the one member, and we focused on now to ask the question of how it's expected to change. And we focus on mid-century because the RCPs, the climate scenarios, don't differ that much mid-century between 4.5 and 8.5. But yet, there is change in kind of mean annual precipitation among different climate models, and we're taking account that uncertainty. And so you can see in our region, the annual precipitation could go anywhere from wetting and drying, the lower bound and upper bounds. while the temperatures are expected to increase across the region. And so what we found when we did all this air propagation across the region is the forests are expected to increase a 31% gain in productivity between 2010 and 2055, with the southern region having a near zero change, to the northern region having fairly large changes due to lengthening growing seasons, interacting with higher CO2. And this under the hood assumes that the foresters keep up with nutrient limitation by fertilizing the forests. And so, that's sort of implicitly taken into account here. But we went through all that effort to propagate uncertainty. And so the 95th quantile here is in some cases negative, where the biomass declines over the next kind of half century, particularly out west where it gets drier. Consistently gets drier across the climate models, to large gains. And these large gains, may seem really high, but that's actually kind of, like raw, like, you always have to figure out whether you're going to plot absolute versus relative. And so the lower productivity up in the northern bits gets enhanced by quite a bit. And so, we have this uncertainty. And ultimately, all the work discovered that we need to continue to work on better forest models right now, because that was the largest source of the total uncertainty, was the error that we estimated in the process model from going through this exercise of kind of separating out the model error from the observation error. And this has led to a decision support tool that was co-developed with the forest industry, where folks at the North Carolina State University kind of did a lot of the testing of like, what do they want to see, what's the best way to visualize it. So it's led to a decision support tool where you can kind of click on a location and see how it's expected to change. And so so that's an example of forests. And the final example that I'm excited to talk about is environmental observatories. And so the environmental observatory I want to highlight is NEON, which I mentioned earlier. This is an incredible program, 81 sites across the US that include a mix of terrestrial and aquatic sites, and with standardized measurements, all freely available, with anywhere from instantaneous availability to a 7-day delay to typical is a month delay, and then some of the ones that require kind of an individual IDing a particular tick, a year delay. But what's neat about this project is it's actually viewed as the equivalent of the physicists coming together and deciding to build a satellite to observe some sort of space phenomena. NSF has a program to build those, and the ecologists said, hey, we should build an observatory. And so NEON collects the data, makes it available, and then it's up to the community to use it and to do the science with it. And so we wrote a proposal to use, that's the Ecological Forecasting Initiative Research Coordination Network, to leverage this data to build capacity in ecological forecasting by using NEON data products. And this is a 5-year project that I'm the lead of. And our first meeting was actually scheduled for May 2020, and you can imagine how quickly that turned into a virtual meeting, which led to a 40-person meeting becoming a 200-person meeting, and led to a lot larger engagement than we expected. So that was really awesome. And so the big motivating thing was the idea of designing a forecasting challenge, a challenge to the community to forecast NEON data before it's collected. And in many cases of kind of ecology and other worlds, like the idea of a data science forecasting competition is starting to emerge. It's been around, there's like, basically data model comparisons, data science challenges, but a consistent forecasting challenge across different ecological variables has not been done before. And that's what we are really tackling. And so it is a formalized challenge to the community to develop an iterative near-term forecast of NEON data before they are collected, a genuine test of our ability to predict the future. And what makes their data science? Some characteristics of common data science competitions are, the evaluation is often on data that have already been collected at the time of the competition, where the hosts hold it back. Oftentimes they're point-based, focusing on accuracy, and they're single submissions. Everyone submit your forecast on May 1 of the number of widgets that are going to be sold at store Y. And there's many different kind of platforms for doing this. Kaggle is one of them. There's others, like Data Driven is really focused on social good projects. Zendy is focused on, is an Africa focus. There's things like that. Our forecasting challenge really focuses on evaluation using data that has yet to be collected. So the hosts actually can contribute too. We focus on probabilistic evaluation, and we're iterative. You can submit forecasts continuously every day. And so we're really kind of using this to push the boundaries of forecasting. And so this virtual meeting really got a lot of engagement that led to design teams being formed, cyber infrastructure being developed, standards for how to, formats of forecast submissions so that they can all be evaluated in a common framework, and then development of partnerships with federal agencies, computational resources, that kind of thing. And we, the first forecasts, we launched it in fall 2020. The first forecasts have rolled in starting in 2021, and it's still going on, and we're in round 2 now. To date, we have over 200 involved in planning at 52 different sites, 54 different teams, 2,500 unique forecasts, and 1.5 million scored observations to date. And it's been the foundation of 4 graduate classes. It is an incredibly awesome final project in a class because the students work towards building a model, and they submit it and compare it to others all across the world. And see how well they do. And so it's been a really, really awesome to see these courses kind of use it as a focal point. And so we've developed common forecast protocols across 5 different ecological themes. There's an aquatics theme, temperature, oxygen, and chlorophyll. There's a tick theme, larval abundance, terrestrial carbon and water fluxes, beetle community richness, and the phenology of greenness and redness, when leaves come out in the spring and when they drop in the fall. And these are meant to span ecology, population, community, ecosystem, dynamics, terrestrial, aquatics. And what's so powerful about the NEON network is all of these are available through like the same API. And so we're really able to kind of span ecology in a fairly straightforward way. And in many cases, they're forecasting 35 days in the future, except in the case of the tick and larval abundances, which are because those are collected at short, coarser intervals. They forecast a little bit further in the future. And so this basically leverages and builds on many of the elements that I talked about in the FLARE forecasting project for water quality, where we have our observation system where it's NEON data. The target generation is the conversion of the raw NEON data into a format that is ready to be ingested in the model and is in the format that is how it's going to be evaluated. And this is a group of volunteers who come together to design these, and we call these design teams, because you have to process down the data and come up with the best way to do it. For example, if there's a sensor is continue collecting, but it's missing 30% of the data one day, does that count as a day with an observation to use in the challenge? Well, that's up to a design team to figure. The design teams also design the null models, like climatology, null, that the average, that tomorrow is going to be the average of the data for tomorrow over the past years, or the persistence. They kind of serve up a set of baseline models. The community contributes their forecasts. They all get moved around in the cloud to be evaluated and visualized and scored. And so this is all occurring kind of automated in the background, and has been really kind of fun to develop, and is all open source code that's available for other folks to use. And so here's an example. any team can contribute, a single person, a class, a research group. So in the case of phenology, here's a bunch of teams that have contributed, and this was forecast last year, and you can see that the dots are the observations after they have been collected, and you can the point here is to say different sites. Different teams have estimated uncertainty, different widths. They're all different kind of hypotheses on what it will look like. We can take these down and coalesce them down into this CRPS number, but they're emphasizing probability distributions. We're emphasizing uncertainty estimation in addition to kind of the mean. We're evaluating the whole distribution, and so you can start to rank the teams by their score. I'll give you a little example of an analysis that goes into kind of evaluating these. This is the phenology analysis, or the phenology theme. And this is in New Hampshire. And this is right. So on the left-hand side here is greenness. So a number down here is basically the stems plus some of these trees. And around our spring, it ramps up. And so the forecast challenge is to basically predict number. And this picture was taken from a camera pointed to the forest, and with the greenness extracted from this image. This was right here, about half greenness up. And so we've identified these sort of key points where the greenness is 50% of the max, of the difference between the max and the min. And we've asked, how far in the future can we predict this? And so here are an example. This is that date, 0, where it's about 50% greenness. And now we can go back in time and 35 days in the future, how good was our prediction? And with a lower score being better. And here's an example of 2 models. This is taking the mean historical greenness for this day and just applying it. And so that doesn't get any better as you get closer to that date, because you don't have any information to update your average of that date. And so that's why it's a flat line. It's a pretty good line. The historical mean is a pretty good estimate of what is going on. On the other hand, persistence, tomorrow is the same as today, is horrible 35 days out. But as you get closer, it's actually taken into account that you're actually starting to go up this curve, and it gets better as you get closer. And so this is an example of a forecasting model that does update with new data. And this is an example of a forecast model that does not update with new data. And you throw all the other teams that have submitted, and you can see that there's this range of teams that clearly do not update with new data and teams that do. And so really this analysis, to do this by asking how good do you get, how does your accuracy on a particular date improve as you get closer to that date, really requires iterative forecasts and like standardized formats across these so that we can kind of build these sort of plots easily. And the take home from here, so the historical mean is this line, and only 2 models really kind of beat it. And they start to beat, one model starts to beat the historical mean about 15 days out. But there's a lot of models that just don't even do, you might as well just take the average of the historical data. And so we're starting to learn about what the difference is between these models that do well versus others. And so this forecasting challenge is a broader means to advance the field of ecological forecasting. It requires developing protocol standards and best practices for environmental forecasting. That benefits ecological forecasting at large, not just the challenge. Creating training opportunities to encourage diverse participation in the challenge, developing software tools, engaging in federal agencies and other partners in the development, and ultimately using all the submissions to provide the basis of a multi-forecast synthesis that highlights patterns across ecological system and scale. And one of the key things is really thinking about how to use forecasting to diversify the field of ecology and ecological forecasting. And so we've really focused a big effort on pushing forward things like, what do diverse students really need to thrive in data and computational heavy settings? What does culturally competent data science training look like? How can our community college system which is a oftentimes an entree into our kind of 4-year system. How can they get training that helps transition into a more quantitative environmental science and ecology field in our 4-year universities? What does inclusive pedagogy look like? What educational materials do we need? And and offering kind of early career training opportunities as well. And so one of the exciting things about being here in Australia is working with folks envisioning what ecological forecasting challenges might look like here. And Australia has an amazing network that is thought of as a parallel network to NEON called TERN, Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network. And here it shows an example of, they have 16 super sites where all different measurements are being made. And so one of the goals of my visit here is to work with TERN and others in Australia to help do the knowledge transfer to empower a forecasting challenge to be run here by an emerging community of ecological forecasting scientists across Australia and New Zealand. And so, to kind of wrap up, the environmental data science themes that you've seen, again, are this idea of spatially and temporally heterogeneous data of varying quality. Basically, you saw that I use a lot of processed mechanistic models that allow you to kind of build in how you think the system works, history of studying the system in different ways, but combining it with state-of-the-art statistical tools. I really focus on forecast uncertainty. The groups I work with and the teams that I work in really focuses on automation and reliability and reproducibility of workflows. And finally, a theme you can see is really involvement of stakeholders and users to really increase engagement and decision support. And all of this is done kind of in the context of thinking about the community of ecological forecasting, not an individual doing it. And so sabbatical in Perth, it's been awesome. Kaylin and I have been here since the end of March, and it's been really wonderful to get away and to really meet all the wonderful folks here and see the city. And so if you're interested in learning more about the NEON Forecasting Challenge or envisioning other challenges, happy to chat. If you're interested in using actually modules that teach forecasting in your classes, we gave a master class in this on Monday, and think that if you're interested in those, there's a group of people who did that, and you could chat with them too about whether you think it's what their experience was. And broadly, if you're interested in ecological modeling or system modeling, data science, ecosystems, global change, data assimilation, Bayesian statistics, eddy covariance, let's talk. I'm excited. That's the purpose of sabbatical. And so, I appreciate your attention, and thank the many funding agencies and partners that have been part of the work that I've shown here. That has been a huge amount of team effort, way more than what I could do, but been funded by various groups, and has just been a wonderful opportunity to kind of work with some awesome people. So I appreciate your attention, and I invite questions.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Quinn. That was a really excellent talk. So if anyone has any questions that you would like to ask, either feel free to unmute yourself and ask them, or pop them in the chat box and we can keep an eye on those. To kick things off, I think I can't see any there. Unless anyone else has a question, I might start off since I'm hosting today. I think for me, one of my questions is, what do you think the scope is for building some of this forecasting that you've talked about into agricultural systems, and sort of forecasting agricultural, like crop productivity and that sort of thing?
Yes. Agricultural productivity is an interesting challenge. It's definitely on the radar. One of the reasons why we haven't initially focused on is because NEON is not in agricultural systems. And so, building out kind of forecasting quickly across a lot of different ecological themes, really requires something like NEON, and that's why we focused on that. Also, the funny thing about agricultural forecasting and forecasting commodities is that it can sometimes devolve into forecasting the forecast. And because, it's about, because folks are, if you can forecast the forecast, you can forecast how someone's going to respond to the forecast. And so you can, kind of get a leg up in a commodity market. And so, we haven't gotten in there yet, for kind of reasons of kind of not necessarily wanting to get into that space when we're kind of building out some of the foundations. But it's definitely useful and on the map. One of the things that we're excited about is that the U.S. has a long-term agricultural research network where they've been doing a lot of, and we're excited about starting to forecast their kind of carbon uptake of ag systems. So not yields, not commodity necessarily related things, but actually the carbon storage and also the phenology. Like, they have these same kind of cameras doing greenness pointed at fields. And so forecasting like the emergence of, and the various, life stages that you could pick up on with a phenocam is also an exciting way of pulling in the agriculture without necessarily, forecasting the number of bushels of corn that will come off. But we hope that many of the different techniques and perspectives that we're developing can be transferred over to the agricultural sector.
Nice, excellent, thank you. It's a great answer. Atbin Mahabadi, a PhD student of mine, has asked a question in the chat. So Atbin's been doing a lot of work on machine learning and uncertainty analysis and improving uncertainty analysis in eddy covariance. And so you can probably see this, but I'll read it out. Just
I can read the question.
Yeah, okay, perfect, go for it.
Yeah. So the programming languages are, we are not using machine learning. The forecasting challenge doesn't require you to use R. Any model can be developed in any way. So it's not that we're specifically excluding deep learning models. I will, and so there's no reason why we're not specifically. I will say we are. We did have a project that I can point you to where it was really cool kind of collaboration. We have at Virginia Tech, there was a folks doing physics guided machine learning where they kind of bake into machine learning models of water temperature the fact that your machine learning model can't predict that the density is highest at the top of the lake, because that just physically can't happen. And so they bake that into as a constraint on the machine learning model. We went to them and said, I don't care about your mean, I want to see your uncertainty. They went back and thought about it and thought about some of the ways in which uncertainty is propagated in machine learning. Some of the methods are where you called knockout, where you like basically zero out nodes and things like that in a deep learning type model. They realized when you do that, what it does is it breaks the physics you assumed in the first place. And so it led them to develop something called physics guided architecture, where you actually bake the physics into how the deep learning nodes are built, which then allows uncertainty propagation to not break the physics in the model. And that paper was presented at a SIAM machine learning, deep learning conference, and has been pretty well received as a method for propagating uncertainty in water temperature predictions using kind of a hybrid of machine learning and physics-based knowledge of the system. And the second question is, what do we do to decrease model uncertainty? So, one of the ways is to, revisit the model over time and ask kind of where the model is performing well. That's another place that deep learning can come in. You can use deep learning to examine the condition under which the model kind of performs worse, and then say, wow, okay, this is clearly related to mixing or that kind of thing. And then work back in and try to build and update the model, and then help reduce that kind of process uncertainty. That's one way. But mostly it's just like over time learning when it fails and succeeds and revisiting the configuration of the underlying model.
Awesome, thank you. Anyone else have any questions at all? While you think about it, I was also curious about how you've found forecasting some of the processes in the less dynamic ecosystems, for example, evergreen systems, because a lot of our ecosystems over here in Australia, for example, we don't see quite the level of phenological change and seasonality as some of the systems in the Northern Hemisphere. And so have you dealt with many of those sorts of systems yet? And what do you feel like some of the gotchas might be?
Yeah. Yeah, the in particular with respect to the greenness. Are they, well, so like, for example, like we have evergreen systems, but like those loblolly pines that I showed you, their leaf area cuts in half. So even though they're evergreen, they can have, dynamic nature to them. And so I didn't know if there may be systems that are classified as evergreen, but may have kind of drought-driven changes in LAI or something like that. But I mean, the signal to noise may be such that climatology and persistence win, and I think it's important for us to go through ecology and be like, yeah, just collect more data, or just measure it, and that's all you need to do to know what's going on. And so we can start to kind of put these problems in their bins, so we sort of know, whether it's really I mean, if evergreens don't really change, and you assume that tomorrow's the same as today, but you don't have data of today, then your prediction of tomorrow would be poor. And so it might just be an example of let's just observe them better, and so let's put things in the bins. And the only way to do that is to forecast more things and try and expect to fail.
Yep, test it out, really test out the modeling and the forecasting. Okay, well, I guess if there's no further questions, I also saw that you've shared one of your papers in the chat box. And so for those of you who are interested in that, do go and check out some of Quinn's work. There's some really excellent stuff that he showed us today. If there are no other questions at all, I can't see anyone who's got their hand up or anything. I'm sure I speak for everyone here where I say thank you very much for such an interesting talk. It was really cool to hear about some of the work that you've been doing in the US, and I really hope that we can find some good ways to build synergies over here in Australia with some of our research projects as well. And so, yeah, thank you very much.